Chapter 14. Coffee versus Tea. The last chapter ended on a genuinely strange note. 19th-century chemists believed caffeine, coffee's active stimulant, and theine, tea's active stimulant, were nearly identical compounds. Some assessments even suggested they weren't meaningfully different substances at all. And yet, for centuries, entire nations organized themselves fiercely around one drink or the other. They treated the choice between coffee and tea as something far more significant than personal taste. This chapter is about how that divide actually formed. It turns out to have a lot less to do with chemistry and a lot more to do with politics than you might expect. England chooses tea. It's worth remembering how thoroughly London had embraced coffee by the late 1600s. Thousands of coffeehouses, penny universities, a king who tried and failed to ban them within 11 days. By every reasonable measure, England looked like it was becoming a coffee nation. Then, over the course of the early 1700s, it quietly became something else entirely. The shift wasn't organic. It was, in large part, a deliberate commercial push. Tea made significant inroads in England during the first half of the 18th century. Promotional efforts from the British East India Company drove much of this. This was the same trading company that held a lucrative monopoly on importing tea from China. Coffee wasn't a product the East India Company could profit from in the same direct way. So its considerable commercial and political influence went toward building English demand for the beverage it actually controlled. The company successfully turned England into a nation of tea drinkers. Its directors then set their sights on an even larger prize. They wanted to extend that same demand into England's North American colonies. They hoped to turn the American market into another profitable outlet for Chinese tea. It very nearly worked. Then it went spectacularly, permanently wrong. A tax that would not go away. The trouble started with money, as these things usually do. Parliament passed the Stamp Act in 1765. It taxed a wide range of paper goods across the American colonies. This triggered the now famous colonial rallying cry of, "No taxation without representation." It sparked enough organized resistance that Parliament repealed the act within a year. But the underlying principle remained unresolved in London's eyes. Did Parliament have the right to tax the colonies at all? In 1767, new duties landed on paint, oil, lead, glass, and tea. Colonial resistance flared up again. Colonists boycotted British manufactured goods so effectively that English manufacturers themselves began pressuring Parliament for relief. Parliament eventually repealed every one of the new duties, except the one on tea. Parliament kept that duty in place specifically to preserve the principle that it retained the right to tax the colonies whenever it chose. The colonists' response was every bit as pointed. Rather than compromise their principles by buying taxed English tea, they simply found another supplier. They launched a brisk and thoroughly illegal trade, smuggling tea in from Holland instead. The British East India Company watched one of its most promising markets slip away entirely. It appealed to Parliament for help. Parliament granted it a privilege it had never held before, the right to export tea directly to the American colonies itself, bypassing the usual channels. Cargoes went out to hand-picked commissioners in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston. This set the stage for exactly the kind of confrontation that followed. The party that chose America's national drink. On the night of December 16, 1773, a group of Boston citizens, disguised as Native Americans, boarded the East India Company's tea ships sitting in Boston Harbor. They threw the entire cargo of tea into the water. It's one of the most famous acts of political theater in American history. Its immediate political consequences, as the spark that helped set the American Revolution in motion, are well known to just about everyone. What's less widely appreciated is the beverage-related consequence of that single night. It's a genuinely striking one. Historians generally credit this specific act of protest as the moment that determined America would become a nation of coffee drinkers rather than tea drinkers. It broke sharply from England's own beverage habits. The Tea Party planted a lasting, deep-seated cultural prejudice against tea in America. One account written roughly a century and a half later noted that America had still not fully overcome this prejudice. In the years that followed the Revolution, this same cultural shift rippled outward through similar protests in New York, Pennsylvania, and Charleston. Coffee gradually, deliberately became the king of the American breakfast table. It became the default daily drink of the entire American people. Sit with that for a moment. An entire nation's multi-century beverage preference traces back, in significant part, to a single night of harbor vandalism. Americans today reach for a cup of coffee each morning rather than a cup of tea, the way most of England still does. And that habit grew out of a protest against the tax policy. A policy that had nothing whatsoever to do with the actual quality or chemistry of either drink. Coffee was already fueling the rebellion. Here's a detail that makes the Tea Party's role in coffee's American triumph feel even more fitting. Coffee houses, not tea houses, had already been serving as the actual planning grounds for the rebellion itself. This happened well before the harbor protest made the symbolic break with tea official. Boston's most celebrated coffeehouse tavern was a place called the Green Dragon. It stood on Union Street in the heart of the city's business district for a remarkable 135 years. From 1697 all the way to 1832. Over that long run, it hosted an extraordinary cross-section of colonial society. British officers, royal governors, powdered crown officials, and, increasingly as tensions rose, a growing circle of revolutionists and conspirators. Some of the very people responsible for planning the Boston Tea Party met there. Daniel Webster himself later described the Green Dragon as nothing less than the headquarters of the revolution. It was here, over cups of coffee, that figures like Joseph Warren, John Adams, James Otis, and Paul Revere gathered as a self-organized committee working toward securing freedom for the colonies. The actual planning and organizing of American independence unfolded, quite literally, in a coffeehouse. So by the time the Tea Party made America's rejection of tea symbolically and politically permanent, coffee had, in a very real sense, already been doing the work of revolution for years. The Green Dragon's patrons had been meeting, talking, and organizing over coffee long before a single chest of tea ever hit Boston Harbor's water. The Tea Party didn't so much create America's coffee preference from nothing. It finally made official, in dramatic and unforgettable fashion, a shift that had already been quietly underway in rooms like the Green Dragon for years. Two nations, one shared chemistry. Step back and look at the full shape of this rivalry. Something almost absurd becomes clear. England and America share an enormous amount of common history, language, and culture. Yet they ended up on opposite sides of a beverage divide. That divide had nothing to do with the actual physical effects of either drink. As the last chapter established, contemporary chemistry considered the active stimulant compounds in coffee and tea to be virtually identical. England's tea preference was manufactured, quite deliberately, by a trading company's commercial self-interest. America's coffee preference was forged, just as deliberately if far less calculatedly, out of pure political defiance against that same company and the government backing it. Neither nation arrived at its signature hot beverage through some careful national deliberation over taste or health. Both landed where they landed because of who happened to be selling what, and who happened to be angry at whom, at one particular moment in the 18th century. Both preferences have proven remarkably durable ever since. Later generations treated each one as though it reflected something deep and essential about national character. In reality, it mostly reflects the outcome of a very specific, very political 18th century dispute over tax policy. It's worth remembering too that this rivalry never fully divided the whole world so neatly. Plenty of countries embraced coffee enthusiastically with no tea party of their own to explain it. Later chapters in this book on regional coffee consumption make that clear. Plenty of tea-drinking nations never had an East India Company actively marketing the drink into their kitchens. England and America's particular split is a genuinely unusual case. Two closely related societies sharing a common origin, pushed toward opposite beverage preferences by the specific political and commercial pressures of a single turbulent decade. It's a reminder that even something as personal and habitual as a morning drink can end up shaped less by individual taste than by the political currents of a given historical moment. The numbers tell the same story. The Boston Tea Party story might sound almost too tidy to be entirely believable. One dramatic night, single-handedly deciding an entire nation's beverage preference? The actual consumption statistics gathered in the decades that followed back it up remarkably well. Well into the 20th century, American coffee consumption kept climbing steadily. This stood in sharp contrast to American tea consumption, which had actually fallen to less than half of what it had been half a century earlier. In the United Kingdom, meanwhile, the exact opposite pattern held. Tea drinking maintained the same steady popularity it had enjoyed for centuries. Coffee simply never gained meaningful ground. What makes this contrast even more interesting? England's continued devotion to tea actually made it something of an outlier. Not a model the rest of Europe was quietly following, but an exception to it. Coffee enjoyed roughly the same kind of enthusiastic popularity across much of continental Europe that it did in the United States. Major coffee ports at Hamburg, Bremen, Copenhagen, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Antwerp, Le Havre, Bordeaux, Marseilles, and Trieste all funneled enormous quantities of coffee into markets. None of these markets had ever experienced anything resembling a Boston Tea Party of their own. Scandinavian countries in particular ranked among the world's heaviest coffee drinkers per person for decades on end. Norway was consuming roughly 8.8 pounds of coffee per person as early as 1876. Denmark wasn't far behind at 5.2 pounds. Sweden sat at 5 pounds. The Netherlands posted an even more striking figure during that same period, unsurprising given everything covered in the earlier chapter on Java. 17.6 pounds of coffee consumed per person. Belgium wasn't far behind at 9.1 pounds. In other words, England's tea loyalty and America's coffee loyalty weren't really two sides of some universal, worldwide coffee versus tea contest. They were two unusually specific national stories, shaped by two unusually specific sets of historical circumstances. A trading company's marketing push in one case, a harbor full of ruined tea in the other. Meanwhile, an entire continent of countries had settled into their own coffee habits for reasons that had nothing to do with either nation's particular political drama. What's coming next? We've now spent several chapters following coffee through legend, persecution, revolution, cultivation, science, and now a genuine transatlantic rivalry with its own chemical cousin. It's time to follow the money directly. Everywhere coffee traveled, it eventually made someone extraordinarily wealthy. It left plenty of others ruined trying to chase that same fortune. In the next chapter, we look at the coffee barons themselves. The traders, speculators, and entrepreneurs who built vast fortunes on the back of this single crop. And the risks, gambles, and occasional spectacular collapses that came along with trying to control something the whole world had grown to depend on.